I love stories. Muriel Rukeyser said, "The world is not made of atoms, it's made of stories." I heard once about a man whose son would have these knockdown, drag out, just crazy screaming tantrums. He was just a little boy and he would have these tantrums that they just could not control. He'd be screaming and throwing things and hitting. For hours and hours, this little boy would just be like relentlessly inconsolable. And the dad in this story, he tried everything he could think of. He, all the usual techniques. He would yell at him. He would send him to his room. He would try like hugging him or restraining him, reasoning with him. Nothing worked. This kid would just keep freaking out, and there was nothing they could do about it. But in this story, the dad had a magic power. See, the dad loved stories too. And so one day when his son just went bananas, the little boy was in his room and the dad just kind of slipped into his son's bedroom. And he stood in the corner and he started quietly whispering a story. Quietly, barely even audibly, he would start to say, "There once was a little boy who lived in a giant castle." And at first he'd be telling the story to no one. The kid would still be just hysterical. But after a few minutes, as he would just keep telling the story would capture the little boy's attention. And he'd begin to calm down a little bit, and he'd begin to listen. And the dad would just keep telling the story from across the room. And before long, his sniffling son would be sitting on his lap, listening to the story, not even noticing that this storm of his tantrum was washing away. I love stories. I get this like nerdy middle child thrill out of having a good story to share. Dr. Kinnison recently brought up how postmodernism has taken us away from black and white truth and toward the importance and the significance of each person's story. Annette Simmons, in her book, The Story Factor, says that people don't want more information. They're up to their eyeballs in information. They want faith. Faith in you, your goals, your success, and in the story you tell. Sometimes in my job as a youth pastor, I have kids who want information. They want me to prove to them that God exists, or they want black and white, irrefutable, empirical evidence, or for me to scientifically prove to them that God is active in the world and that God loves them. And I can't do that. But what I can do is tell them stories. I get to tell them the story of a God on a rescue mission. I get to tell the ongoing story of God's healing and leading and speaking to me. I get to surround them with stories from people all around them who have had these life-changing encounters with God. Just a couple weeks ago, I met with this guy who told me the most incredible story of God turning his life around from a prison cell. The stories that these kids hear and the stories that they tell shape who they become. And a lot of kids that I work with have spent their entire lives moving from one bad story to the next. I'm a storyteller, and I get to tell the best story ever written to kids who hear a lot of really bad stories. There's a Jesuit priest and psychotherapist named Anthony DeMello, and he says this: "The shortest distance between a human being and the truth is a story." The best way that we can understand the truth of Jesus is through stories. So I thought that maybe the best way to explain how powerful stories can be in helping kids to meet Jesus is to tell you a story that to me explains who Jesus is to us and what Jesus does for us. So when I was about 12, my youth pastor and his wife, Pastor Chuck and Steph, adopted a little baby girl. Her name was Ellie. and I was their #1 primary babysitter. And I always felt like Ellie had a special place in my heart because I was one of the first people to meet her, and I was one of the first people to know that they were going to get her. So I always just had a special place in my heart for little baby Ellie. And I babysat her all the time. At least once a week, I would babysit this little girl. And I loved Ellie. She was the first little one that I really feel like I watched grow up. And I remember one time babysitting her when she was still just a baby, and I was rocking her to sleep one night. And I remember my eyes filling up with tears as a 13-year-old. I remember my eyes filling up with tears, just overwhelmed at how much I loved that little girl. And about 2 years after that, one night, I was babysitting Ellie, and I was about 15 or 16. She was 2 or 3. She'd always been really good for me, really easy to babysit. And one night I put her to bed, and I laid her in her crib, and I said, "Good night, Ellie, I love you." And I turned off the light, and I went back upstairs. And after a couple minutes, I could hear Ellie crying. And after another minute or two, I heard her come back up the stairs. And she came upstairs with her little blankie and her little onesie, and she was just crying. And she, was all just sweaty and snotty. And I picked her up, and I was like, "What's wrong, Ellie? Tell me what's wrong." And she wouldn't. She just kept crying. So I held her for a little while, and then I was like, I don't know what to do. It's getting kind of late. So I just brought her back down, and I laid her back in her crib, and I was like, "Okay, you need to go to sleep now. Good night, Ellie. I love you." And I turned off the light, and I went back upstairs. And a couple minutes later, it happened again. She came back up the stairs, and she was crying. She couldn't tell me why, and so I held her for a little while longer, and then I was starting to get kind of frustrated, and I was like, "I've got to put you to bed. You have to go to sleep." And so I brought her back downstairs, and I laid her in her crib, and I said, "Good night, Ellie. I love you." A couple minutes later, it happens again. So now I'm frustrated. I don't know what to do. And I brought her back downstairs, and I laid her in her crib, and I said, "Ellie, you have to go to sleep. You cannot come upstairs again. Don't come upstairs. You have to stay in your room. You have to go to sleep. Good night. I love you." And I went back upstairs, and after a couple minutes, I just kind of listened, and I could hear her crying. And I was like, why won't she go to sleep? And I was worried that she was going to come back upstairs, and I didn't know what I was going to do if she did that. But she didn't. She didn't come back upstairs, but I could hear her crying. And I could hear her crying get louder and louder and louder. And I knew her well enough to know what an angry cry sounded like, and what a "I'm not getting my way" cry sounded like, and "I don't want to go to bed" cry. But this was not one of those. This was just like a sad, scared, desperate, lonely cry. And I just let her cry for a few minutes, and I just did not know what to do. And I went back downstairs, and I peeked around the corner, and I just wanted to see if she was still in her room. And I looked, and her door was open, and I was like, oh man, she didn't listen to me. But then I looked a little bit further, and I could see her little toes reaching over the threshold of the door. And I could see her little face leaning over the threshold of the door as she just cried out into the hallway. She didn't want to disobey me and leave the room, but she also wanted me to know how scared and sad and lonely she was. And it just broke my heart. So I went over to her, and I scooped her up in my arms, and I was like, "Ellie, I don't know what you want. Tell me what you want." And she just cried and cried and cried into my shoulder. Now at this point, this little girl was getting pretty gross. She was just super sweaty and snotty and just sticky face from all her tears, and her bed, her little crib, had just like damp sheets and snot all over the place. And I remember looking around, and I was like, what else am I going to do? So I laid her back in her crib, and she started to cry, and I was like, it's okay, it's okay. And I pushed down the bar of the crib, and I climbed over, and I raised it back up. And then I curled up into a little ball on the damp, gross sheets of Ellie's little crib. And I took Ellie in my arms like this and laid her down. And I just laid in a tiny little ball in her crib with her. And over again, I just kept saying, "Ellie, you're okay. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Ellie, I'm right here. You're okay. I'm not going anywhere." And the next thing I remember is the lights coming on in the room. and I could see Ellie's little diapered butt bouncing right above my face. And I looked, and Pastor Chuck and Steph had come home, and I was like, oh man, they're going to think I'm just the worst babysitter. They were walking into the room, and I was like, they're going to think that I was just coddling her or enabling her, or they're going to think I'm a weirdo for crawling in their baby's crib. But to this day, when Pastor Chuck and Steph see me, I can go years without seeing them. And they love that story of that night when they came home to me sleeping in a little ball with Ellie in my arms in their crib. To this day, when they see me, they say, remember when you slept in Ellie's crib with her? You loved Ellie. You loved that little girl. So you guys, our God is not one who stays upstairs when we are scared and lonely and afraid. Our God is not one who leaves us to figure things out on our own. Our God climbs into our mess and our sweat and our snot and our tears. Our God is one who stays with us and whispers, I'm right here. You're okay. I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here. You're okay. I'm not going